Welcome back to Built the Ship, where we talk to founders and product leaders building real AI tools. And today I'm super excited to be joined by William, founder of Mirascope, a developer-first library that simplifies LLM integration. William, thanks for joining the podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So yeah, I want to start at the usual spot. What were you doing before Mirascope? What got you to want to make the leap to start a company? Tell us a bit about that journey.
Yeah, I used to work at Google on an applied AI research team called Glassbox. It's a pun on black box machine learning. Big focus on interpretable machine learning and constrained optimization. Kind of operated as like an in-house applied AI team for other product teams inside of Google. So we'd work with maps, search, ads, kind of just to help them get ML models out into their products that they could use.
Amazing. And what from that experience, or was it just a totally unrelated sort of life change or idea? Like, what got you to start Mirascope and leave Google?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was just a realization that if a company like Google and their product teams needed some like specialized research team to actually deploy and launch successful AI models, that, what are other companies outside of Google doing? So left to go talk to all those companies and figure that out and kind of see if there was a space here for, a cool and interesting new product that could really help these teams onboard to this kind of new AI revolution. That was before kind of the whole ChatGPT craze. So, my original hypothesis that like all these software teams are going to have to become machine learning teams accelerated way faster than I thought it would.
Wow, that's awesome. And were you finding, like, while you're at Google, sometimes I hear that people have ideas for ways to build better frameworks or internal tools, but it's just hard to get that like greenlit. Was that kind of a struggle, or was it not so much that, just like you realized other people could use this?
Yeah, I think there's like two pieces here. One is Google's internal tooling is amazing. Like, sure, there's room for improvement, but I think the second we left and we started building our own stuff, we very quickly realized how much we missed all of the internal tools we had at Google. I think the second piece there is, as amazing as those tools are, they're built for an organization of 100,000 engineers, not kind of more standard company sizes that are in the tens, hundreds, thousands. And I think really at the end of the day, it was less about the tools and more about kind of the tribal knowledge of machine learning and AI and what it takes to build those systems successfully. So very early on when we left, it was less about, the specific tools and more about what tools could we build to kind of address the process issues.
Interesting. So you mentioned that one of the things you address is the process issues. Who does that end up making your end user? Like, who uses Mirascope? What's their experience like? What kind of sort of value do you unlock for them?
Yeah, I mean, Mirascope specifically is for, developing LLM apps at the kind of like API level. It's a, one layer abstraction on top of all these LLM APIs, unifies it, makes it provider agnostic, but, we don't take away too much control from the developers. End user there is going to be a software engineer. And, in terms of the process stuff, we've spoken to a lot of teams where when you get to the second stage of that development process where, maybe you've built something and you're vibe checking it, and now you hit a point where, oh, well, like the head of engineering or your CEO is asking you, why is it breaking? And you don't know why. And you need to start adding like instrumentation and evals, that the instrumentation you need, to effectively evaluate AI systems heavily relies on the structure of the system and like how you build it. And we've seen a lot of code bases where they're just not set up for success. And so step one, rather than being let's add instrumentation and evaluation, is actually let's refactor the code base so that it is set up for success. I think like primary goal of Mirascope is, if you're building with Mirascope, you're just already doing the right thing, right? Like the interface forces you into best practices so that a software engineer who is now just like integrating an LLM API into their application doesn't have to be too concerned that when they get to that next stage, they have to go through this like whole refactoring process.
Amazing. Yeah, and I want to excuse me, a plus one to the convo about, or the point about like process being a blocker. We, over at Voker, we have a different kind of end user and slightly different, teams that we work with. But there's definitely a huge overlap where oftentimes it's not the tech or, the capability of the LLM, even though there are limitations. But like the biggest thing is could be approvals from an executive. It could be like aligning on what good looks like. There's going to be 5 different people in the room who all have their own vibe, and at least with a lot of our customers, they don't come with like a golden eval set that's already been signed off on and everyone agrees on. Does that, resonate with you? What does that look like for Mirascope?
Yeah, I think if we like use Voker as a specific example, something that will ultimately be a tough process to solve is when you start talking to like a single end user, they're the only ones who really know how to annotate that data. Right. And so, there's one world in which you build kind of eval and tracing tools that support like a team building a product where they know how to annotate the data. And then there's a world in which you build a product that enables evaluations like all the way down to the end user, um, even to the degree of custom annotation UIs. Right. Like you might have 2 users, and even though they're both using, Voker for like maybe a high level similar ideas or end goals, that like the specific aspects of what they're building, the specific data structures might mean that like the way that they annotate the data requires a custom UI. Right. And so if you can't use custom UIs to annotate that data, you're stuck. Right. And so what we've seen a lot of people end up, in that situation doing is either ripping everything out to go build their own custom thing, or just getting stuck. Much better to say, hey, all the like back end tracing, annotation, like infrastructure is built, but if you need to deploy a custom UI to your end user, like you can easily hook that up to the back end infrastructure. And I think with vibe coding, like vibe coding a custom annotation UI where you don't really have to worry too much about what's happening on the back end and all the connectivity issues, really opens up the door for highly custom annotation UIs for like your specific use case, right? Like maybe you have images and you need to look at 2 images side by side in order to properly annotate that data, whereas someone else might have audio, and like those just require different UIs for annotation.
Totally. No, the surface is, because the capabilities are so broad, which is great, the surface for, the interaction model that a customer's end user might use, audio versus image, et cetera, it's just so much broader. So definitely agree with you that like that flexibility is important. And to, agree with your point about multiple different users in a similar use case, we see this happen all the time. You're right. Like one evangelist within a company will build a use case, someone else will see it, be excited, want to use it, but then they're like, but I don't, consider this response good. I want to change it. And so for us, a lot of that is like thinking about how do we make it easy for them to collaborate, duplicate, save as much of like the work and benefit from like what that other person did, without also just having 2 people compete with like, I want to change this, configuration for this use case to my needs. So instead, let them split it out. Yeah. How do you, when it comes to like refactoring and all of that, like how do you approach these conversations? When I assume like sometimes you have customers that like haven't started yet, but some of them probably already have tried, certain frameworks or just going at it without Mirascope. Is that a difficult conversation? Is there a lot of like refactoring they have to do? Is there, yeah, what does that like implementation process look like? What's the switching look like?
Yeah, there's different degrees of like necessary refactoring. Mirascope provides best practices by default, but like you can technically do the same things whether or not you use Mirascope if you know to do those things. So, oftentimes when we talk to end customers who are going to use LilyPad, which is our like ops and evals tooling, step one is we've actually built LilyPad around the idea that you've probably implemented code that needs to be refactored, but refactoring is not top of mind. So like, let's get you what you want first, which is like some form of eval. And now it might be that that eval has to be in your dev environment because you have unintended side effects in your code that are like impossible to evaluate as it's currently implemented separately from the AI. But even just getting a metric in your dev environment kind of shows you next steps more clearly, where you stand today, what your pass rate is, so on and so forth. And then I think the second bit is the refactoring becomes extremely clear as you start to actually try to implement and like instrument your code and implement evals. And so I actually say the majority of people we talk to, they've just hit a wall. And so like the refactoring conversation, it's not that we're selling refactoring, right? What we're saying is like, what's our goal? Where are we trying to get, you as an organization so that you're set up for success? And what does that look like? Mirascope just makes doing that refactoring way easier.
Awesome. I love the like goal first framing, especially with like new technologies. It's easy to like find people who are really interested in trying things out. And I think oftentimes in our process, and probably for yours, it sounds like too, it's like a lot of it's consulting with these leaders or developers, et cetera, of like, let's focus on like what are you actually trying to achieve. They'll have a lot of ideas for what they want to do. And part of our job is to like, because we talk to so many people, because we've used LLMs for a lot of different use cases, we've seen what works, what doesn't, helping them frame that first what's the first outcome and move from there is super important. um I wanted to ask a bit about like your stack, the way you work internally. You mentioned vibe coding. Let's start there. I'm curious your opinion there. You mentioned like, hey, Mirascope helps. A lot of people are doing vibe coding, so if Mirascope works well with that, that's important. But internally, what's kind of your opinion on how to approach using code gen tools?
Yeah, I internally focus significantly more on like call it AI assisted coding. Um, I think there's places where it does a really good job. I think when you're really trying to like push the frontier, uh, if you're not careful and you really just give in to the vibes, it doesn't really do a great job. Um, and I think another thing that people don't tend to understand about, call it vibe coding, is that the super majority of the prompt to that coding agent, call it like Claude Code or Cursor or whatever, is the code itself. And so, all those like big company requirements around like Python style guides and doc strings and type hints and all that stuff that a lot of engineers like shy away from. I think there's two really interesting things here. One is doing it makes the LLM better, right? Because now it has all this like information rather than having to infer it. It's right there front and center. And the second bit is that the LLMs can help you do all that annoying work faster, right? And so when you're doing like boilerplate and you need a doc string for some function, previously it used to be like, oh, well, okay, I'm just going to write this like kind of crappy short whatever doc string just to like have it because they require it. Whereas now, I'll do a bunch of pseudocoding first. And, the assistance I get from, let's say like a Claude Code is, hey, like write an initial draft of this doc string. And that takes me like 80% of the way there. So I only have to put in the 20% to make it really good. By the time I'm asking Claude to implement something at the code level, it's usually a single function that's like no more than 10 to 30 lines of code. I think the second piece that's interesting is test-driven development. It's so annoying. And when you're not like super clear on what you want to build or how you want to build it, starting with tests is slow. But if you can just like pseudocode your whole interface pre-implementation using, AI assistants to get there faster, and then you go to Claude Code and you say, look, I have this like very simple, well-defined function with a doc string, with an example usage in the doc string, go write a test that tests, some number of input-output pairs. And then go build that function against the tests. Like you can very quickly kind of implement like the bottom of the tree and just bubble that up until you have your system built out. And so, I try to operate more as like system architect rather than like the nitty gritty details of like, how am I implementing this regular expression? It's like, yeah, okay, I could sit there and I could do it, but Claude will get me 80, 90% of the way there much faster if the spec is clear the second I ask, and it's much easier if you have very good interface design and documentation and doc strings to, go to Claude and say, build this. even just build this. No crazy prompt, no like crazy prompt engineering, and Claude will do a good job because like you already did the prompt engineering, right? Which was designing the interfaces, writing the examples, writing the doc strings. Like that was really the prompt engineering work you did.
Amazing. Yeah. It sounds like a pretty balanced approach. You're not saying like don't ever use it, but also it sounds like, being thoughtful about your architecture and also putting in the work to, I love that like framing of, hey, all of that upfront work to write tests or to develop, your standard practices. That's really prompting for your future code gen. You mentioned like test driven development, and it made me think about, I know we're pretty involved in the AI LA community. You've given a couple great talks at that event and other places. One thing you've talked about is how, I believe it's LilyPad, uses, kind of your approach to labeling and evals. And it made me think of when you said test driven, like, hey, starting with that first. Can you probably get what I'm referring to. Can you share a little bit about, you know, how you see the best development flow for like an LLM application and having end users labeled, responses and that kind of um, explanation you've given before?
Yeah. I like to call it like eval driven development. I like to call the previous thing documentation driven development, um, specifically for like the vibe coding aspect. On the AI engineering front, it sounds stupid, but it's like the first thing I would do before you actually implement anything with AI is like implement a function that does the thing you want, right? A function is a perfect representation of an optimization system, right? If we like wrote it on paper, like f of x equals whatever, that like in code, you'd have some named function that takes some inputs and returns some output. And the internal function body is the like weights of your optimization system. And, it might seem stupid, but like start with defining the system and have it return a fixed constant value. Right. So, for example, you might be like, well, I'm building, chat with Mirascope docs. And so this is going to be a fairly straightforward retrieve relevant chunks, generate based on relevant chunks. It's like the first thing I would do is just build the scaffold and have the retriever return just wrong information, fixed, just say return like an empty list. And then have the, generation function, no AI, just take in those chunks and return, I don't know, 42 as a string. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. And then go instrument it, go version it, and go build a small eval set, like 5 examples, and annotate them and hand label them. Right. And the idea is there's like, yeah, sure, you'll probably get a 0% pass rate, right? It'll fail on 5 out of 5 times. But now you have your like initial system. And so then when you go and you add the simplest, let's say, retriever piece, maybe you're just using like BM25, that if you then get 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 5, like, adding that made progress against kind of the thing you actually care about. I think this is also really important because I think software engineers tend to attribute like better performance or better results to more complexity. And with AI, like, unless you actually evaluate it, you don't know. Right. And so you might go add some like crazy hybrid search algorithm to retrieve relevant chunks when it turns out maybe you didn't even need to retrieve chunks at all. Maybe actually the context window was large enough. You could have put the whole thing in there and it would have done well enough. Why spend any time doing the chunking at all if you don't need to? Right. And so for us, it's like start as simple as possible, see how the system performs, and go from there.
Amazing. Yeah. Sounds like crawl, then walk, then run, which is like, maybe common sense, but it's amazing how many people their first use case is like, I want to build a chatbot that can book appointments and answer any FAQ questions and do this and that. It's like, okay, well, why don't we just start with one of those first?
Yeah, I think something I find the most interesting is, I like to think of these like LLM functions as machine learning models, right? The difference being that rather than having like an actual machine learning model, like a linear regression model or something, or a neural net with weights that are saved in some file, that like the weights are really the prompt and the temperature and you name it. Like, it's been hard enough for a long time to get a single machine learning model in the traditional ML case to do a good enough job. Now you have software teams building agents that are collections of like tens to hundreds of these LLM calls that they now have to not only evaluate individually, but in tandem. And to me, it's like, yeah, learn to crawl first. Like, get one piece of that agent working well, right? Like, if you have some agent that's supposed to like extract information from documents and there's 10 document types, maybe first start with like classifying which document you have and like make that really good and learn the process to make that good. Not only will that simplify the downstream task, right? Because by the time you now are handling a document, you can start doing like specific, call it prompt engineering against that document type. But by the time you're doing that, you've already gone through the process of like making a simple piece of it work well. So now as you start, getting progressively more complex, you're set up for success.
Love it. Yeah, and on the note of evals as you go and starting off there, and even if it's just 5, what about accuracy? Like you talked about traditional ML models. In my experience, lots of times you're looking for really high, like you're not going to ship something that's like 70% accurate, whatever your metric is, right? For like precision, recall, whatever. You're really looking for those higher numbers. Do you think, like, what do you see and what do you recommend to companies you work with in terms of like what is good, great, when it comes to LLMs? And do people need to shift their mindset around what they should expect, like, 100% accuracy, for example?
It's problem specific. My favorite example is Waymo. It's like, first of all, when you're first starting Waymo, you can't just be like, we're sending the car on the road to get data. Oops, it crashed, 5 out of 5 times. It's like, you just can't take that risk. And so there's a lot of, I think, like prep work around if we are to release this, like what's our threshold and why? Right? For something like Waymo, where like the cost of a mistake could be a human life, your threshold is going to be very different from, ChatGPT just outputting like some blob of text that might be hallucinated. It's like if it's hallucinated and you notice it's hallucinated, like, okay, not so bad. So I really think it's problem specific. And yeah, I mean, look, 100% accuracy is going to be extremely hard if possible. It's really just a matter of where's the like quality bar, where's the value bar, right? It might be actually that 70% or even 50% is good enough for some cases. If I said, hey, you could like flip a coin and in one case you might get garbage and in the other case you might get huge success, like, look at something like Cursor or Claude Code, where you have all these people saying, well, sometimes it spits stuff out and I, get restored dot and I delete it all. And it's like, so the threshold there for quality is way lower. And so you can start launching way earlier. And, that's the second piece of it, which is the sooner you launch, the sooner you get real world data, the sooner you get users using your system, the sooner you can spin up your data flywheel to actually start improving it over and over again. And, at the end of the day, like the real moat is your data flywheel.
Totally. And Mirascope helps you build that with, evals right there as you're building the system. How do you think about like the market in general? Where do you position Mirascope? How do you explain the difference? This is something we struggle with all the time. There's so many tools popping up, right? And there's, just like you said earlier, on the accuracy depends on the problem. It's the same for tooling, right? Like whether Voker is a fit for a situation or, Lang views or something else is really just dependent on your business needs and all of that. And I'm sure it's the same for Mirascope. You know, do you what's the landscape for you? Are you guys comparable to like LangChain? Explain maybe like how you think about where you fit in this ecosystem. That's just like a household name everyone talks about, for example.
Yeah, I think, on the like specific tooling piece, a big focus for us is like extremely clear documentation, interfaces that, don't get in your way. Our tagline for Mirascope is abstractions that aren't obstructions, right? The idea is that we should really only be abstracting away the things that you don't need to care about. So the glue and kind of the connectivity and, making something work for one provider or another provider, you shouldn't have to be maintaining internal libraries for OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, you name it, right? You should have one unified interface. But, when you start getting into the like agent world, if the agent is doing a bunch of stuff under the hood for you and you don't have control of that, right, with a non-deterministic system, it becomes very hard to make that good, right? You need full control over every piece that is non-deterministic. So we've kind of taken a bottoms up approach rather than saying, hey, look how easy we make it to build a demo. We've gone more after the like, okay, so you built your demo and now you're ready to productionize your system. Like, here's the tooling you would build yourself if you had an internal dev team, rather than using some kind of out of the box library. And then I think the second piece here is that, like, at the end of the day, and maybe this is like I should do a better job of selling our product, but at the end of the day, like the tooling is kind of a means to an end. And where I position LilyPad and Mirascope and kind of all the tools we're building is more of like an educational resource that has a partner library that implements all those best practices. Um, and so the hope here is like, if you go to our documentation for Mirascope, that, long term, the vision is that rather than having just documentation for like how to use Mirascope, that actually Mirascope is just the means to learning how to build an AI application. Right. And that LilyPad is just a means to how to actually make that system work well. And that the documentation for it, which, today is somewhat focused on how to use LilyPad, the long-term vision is if you're a software engineer who's never built with AI, you should be able to just read our documentation front to back and be ready to do it well. And like, if at the end of the day, you, for whatever reason, want to choose a different tool, like that's up to you. My main goal is for users to leave our documentation saying, wow, like I actually know how to do this now. And, the hope here is that documentation of that quality results in a belief in tooling of the same quality. And, if the tooling does exactly what, you're learning is best practice, rather than trying to just kind of like sell some product or sell some dream of some automated system, that, most people end up choosing to use those tools.
Amazing. Yeah, I love I think it takes a real belief in your vision, which is super clear, and a real belief in the product and building good product to say, hey, we're comfortable making it easy for you to switch or to use different, tooling. And yeah, I think that's something a lot of engineers really appreciate.
Yeah, we're just so early.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're not that early on cloud infrastructure. So like, whichever tool you choose, it's like, it's got to be a great tool for what you need. But most people kind of like know generally how to build cloud infra. And, I think AWS has done a really good job as one of the earliest movers as an educational resource around cloud infrastructure. And so you end up having a lot of people using AWS. I think we're at that like similarly early inflection point with AI where the like majority of, you can call it like the alpha, the majority of kind of like the benefit of any of these tools is going to be onboarding to AI with no experience with AI.
Yeah, we see the same thing. It's so true. Like a lot of the value, sure, it's easy for customers to like get up and running with a prototype and then to actually ship that to production and have it run consistently without them having to build their own backend infrastructure. But really, a lot of the value is what use cases should we prioritize? How do we do the crawl, walk, run? All of that. So yeah, on the note of like the future, what's you kind of alluded to it a bit, but what's the long-term vision from your scope, or what's, I don't know, maybe you're thinking in days, maybe you're thinking in years. Yeah, what's next?
Yeah, I mean, if I were to think like many steps ahead, like the dream, the goal is self-optimizing agents. I think something we've seen today in terms of like successful agent products, and look, maybe I'm missing a few examples and I'm wrong, but I've really only seen two categories of successful agents. One is agents that have been specifically reinforcement fine-tuned to the task, right? So let's, OpenAI Codex, Claude Code, OpenAI Deep Research, right? All these model providers are actively RL fine-tuning these models to have models specific for the task at hand. My argument would be that if the model providers need to do it, what makes you think you don't? And I think the second piece here is, you'll see like Manus or Bolt or Lovable. I think there's two pieces here that have enabled them to be successful. One is they're playing into what the model providers are already reinforcement fine tuning their models against. So, you've got like these canvas features and coding features. And so now you want to build kind of like a vibe coding tool. Well, you're playing into the model's strengths. And so as the model providers build better and better models, your tool will just get better because you're playing into that strength that they're kind of taking care of for you. And then I think the second bit is, a little bit of selling a pipe dream, right? So people want this, like, it does everything, it does an amazing job, it spits out like a perfect thing. And yet, I think we consistently see people who build a prototype in some form of vibe coding platform or tooling and then have to go through the productionization process. Right. And we've personally experienced this. I got home one night and had an idea for an update for our website. Was like, I've never vibe code. I'll give into the vibes. And, I ended up with a landing page and like kind of a content loading system for our docs and, thought, oh, okay, wow, that took a day. We could have this website by the end of the week. And, it ended up taking like 4 to 6 weeks to get to a system that we were happy with, that worked really well, that is maintainable, that, is to the quality we like. And mind you, that's like still using AI assistance for coding. So I think there's just like a really, really big gap today between like true vibe coding and production engineering. And that's not to say that AI isn't extremely useful. It is. But, I'm excited to see that gap, continue to close.
Do you think or worry that, like, so you mentioned like Bolt, for example, Lovable, today they're mostly focused on UIs. Do you think that they'll be able to do things that, you make possible with Mirascope? Like, hey, don't just build this UI with these buttons, build this UI with these buttons powered by this LLM to do this action. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, we actively write our documentation against the idea of like LLMs text or vibe coding or whatever it is. I'll give you like a concrete example. In Mirascope v1, you can use functions as tools in your LLM calls just by writing them as functions. But every single time we ask Claude or OpenAI to like generate Mirascope code, it puts an LLM.tool decorator on the function, even though that's not correct. And even though the documentation doesn't have it anywhere in there, the LLM just wants that. And I think there's one world in which you like try to figure out how to teach the LLM not to do that. And then there's another world, which is what we're doing. And in Mirascope v2, like tools they have an LLM.tool decorator on them. So now it just like will do the right thing. And so I think there's like a kind of two-way sync here back and forth. Like we're actively engineering the docs so that these models do a better job. I think we're also kind of playing into the strengths of the models so that it requires less effort on our front to have the models just do a better job by default.
Awesome. If you have like a couple more minutes, I'm curious to ask you about how you use LLMs in like non-engineering use cases, but let me know if you have the time to spare.
I actually think I use LLMs like maybe like 80 to 90% of my usage of LLMs is non-engineering use cases.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, like the engineering is fun. I like building. I like designing interfaces. Sure, there's like kind of grunt work there. Like I said earlier, writing doc strings or, adding type hints that, sometimes the LLM can like make faster, but that stuff's still fun. It's stuff like project management where I'm like, okay, I need to like write a whole PRD and I need to like do all this stuff. And it's a lot of words. And, Claude gets me like 80, 90% of the way there just by giving it like a quick little brief of what I'm hoping to do. And, things like Claude projects are super helpful. We have like very, very detailed, like multi-thousand word instructions around like our process that we've prompt engineered. And so now if I'm starting a new project, let's say we want to like do something for Mirascope, I can just go to Claude, click on that project and say, hey, this is what I'm kind of thinking, spit out a PRD for me, and it spits it out like exactly as I need. That's actually where I probably find the most use of these LLMs today.
Amazing. And I mean, as a founder, you're having to do everything, right? Like marketing, you mentioned like, project management, growth. Do you use it in those cases too? Like, are you using it for, are you using LLMs for any of those things? Do you use any tools that exist out there? Like I've tried this thing called GAM. First, I tried Google Slides to make, I'm not a fan of making PowerPoints. I've been able to avoid it a lot of my career until now as a founder. And, I went to Google, tried to use Google Slides to create, let's say, like even a pricing sheet, and it just didn't even do anything near what I asked it. So I tried something out called Gamma. The first shot was great, and then like you try to do follow-ups, and it just kind of fails. At least in my experience. Do you use any tools for non vibe coding situations?
I think for me today, I'm mostly like an orchestrator rather than like use a single tool. Um, I get extremely frustrated by exactly that flow you're talking about, where it's like the first thing is
Yeah.
80% of the way there. And if the tool is not then purpose built, knowing it's only going to get me 80% of the way there, and that I have to do that last 20%, I get super frustrated with the tool. For example, for slides, I really like Canva because Canva has a lot of just really good tooling pre-AI that they built around building slides. And so then you're like, okay, I want to put an image in this slide. Well, I'll go to ChatGPT, I'll go to their image gen model, or I'll go to Gemini and I'll go to their image gen model and I'll have it generate an image. And then I'll take it to Canva, and Canva has like background remover. And so like it's a very quick flow. And I really like to think in terms of like automation and usage of AI. I saw this chart a while ago that was essentially like how often you do something and how long it takes determines whether or not you should automate it. Right. And so like if it's something that takes an hour, but you only do it every 3 months, it's like the automation is not worth the time to set up. If it's something that takes 10 to 20 minutes and you do it every day, that's a lot of time saved. Right. And even more so if it's like I do this every day and it takes an hour, like data entry. That's the stuff where I'm like, okay, I should really start to think through like, how do I automate this stuff? Project management is kind of similar there, where like a lot of the boilerplate can take up a lot of time. And if the AI can save me, even just 10, 20 minutes a day on that, that's a lot of time to get back each week.
I'd personally add one more variable there, which is like, how much do I dread that task?
True.
It might even take 10 minutes, but I just can't get myself to do it. And so that's where it plays.
Yeah. Although the question becomes, what do I dread more, the task as it is, or the frustration of the AI not doing the task correctly?
Yeah.
And now I got to go in and be like, well, now I have to do it anyway.
Yep. No, that is I totally agree with you. That frustrates me to no end. It's like, okay, I'm gonna try this out. Okay, it seems like it's working. Let's do the one little, modification. Oh no, it's completely failed. I now need to go back to scratch and do it all myself. On that note of Google Slides, like as someone who worked at Google before, what's your perspective on like why Sheets doesn't? I mean, you can do like an LLM call in the cell in Google Sheets, and but you can't like really ask it to like create a cash flow statement for you or something yet. Is that just like their strategy that they're just going to kind of focus on the infrastructure side and wait till other companies solve those things and then acquire them? Or do you think it's like, just a really hard problem? Or is it like bureaucracy that it takes a long time to prioritize these improvements? I mean, big companies move smaller than startups. That's why startups exist. But yeah, what do you think there?
I think it's a hard question because I think there's like two potential paths, right? There's one where like the LLMs are actually good enough where people can start doing things they couldn't do before. And then there's the other world where they're like almost good enough, which means an expert can now operate like force multiplied 5 to 20x capacity, but it still requires the expert. I think a good example would be like, okay, you need to set up like a cap table projection in Google Sheets. Well, if you don't really know anything about cap tables and you just take it at face value, if your prompt isn't perfect,
Yeah.
like, what are you going to do? You're stuck. Right. And so that's the world where it's like, I feel like actually, if you're outsourcing work and knowledge to LLMs rather than using it as a force multiplier on you, I think you're just setting yourself up for failure. right? And I think the flip side of that is you could probably get the Google Sheets or Google Slide AI integration to work well if you narrow down the like what you're trying to get it to do to something where you know exactly what you want it to do. You kind of already have the structure set up, maybe similar to the coding example. Maybe you've already set up like kind of a template. And rather than saying kind of just spit out something from scratch, you say, well, I kind of gave it a try and I spent 10 minutes on it. Here's how I'm thinking about it. Can you like make like one step change improvement from here? This is what I'm trying to do. And I feel like that stuff tends to work significantly better for me.
Makes sense. Well, hey, I appreciate you taking the time. It's been a great chat, and love to do this again. I'm gonna throw your website back up on the screen, but is this the best place to find you, to follow along with Mirascope? Where should people go to follow your journey?
Yeah, you can go to our website. You can go to our GitHub. If you scroll down, we're making this more front and center soon, but there's a join the community button here. That's a great place to engage with the community. You can also DM me. You can follow me on X and DM me there. Love helping people. So if you have any questions or concerns, or you're feeling the pain of lack of evals, let me know. I'm here to help.
Amazing. Thanks, William. Good to see you again. Always great chatting. Thanks for joining us on Built to Ship, and see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.